Bonnie Vandermeulen, Training Coordinator for Wisconsin Facets. On behalf of our entire Wisconsin Facets staff, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. The title of today's webinar is Disabling Inequity in Wisconsin Schools, and our presenters today are Jill Gonzalez and Mary Soretti. Jill and Mary work for Disability Rights Wisconsin and are both advocacy specialists. Together, they bring many years of advocacy experience working with families who have children with disabilities. Mary works for disability rights out of the Milwaukee office, and Jill works out of the Madison office. It gives me great pleasure today to introduce to you Jill and Mary. Ladies.
Hi, I'm Jill Gonzalez, like Bonnie said. Bonnie and I go back some time. I used to work for Wisconsin Facets myself, right before I went to Disability Rights Wisconsin. I got involved in special education advocacy as a parent of a child with a disability who's been in special ed since kindergarten. And so that's where my experience came from. And I then went to school and I got my master's in school social work. I worked for Green Bay area public schools as a social worker and decided after that experience that I really needed to devote my time to parents, teaching them their rights for special education.
And hi, I'm Mary Soretti, and I am sharing my screen, so I cannot see any of you, and I think you can see me, but I have no idea what you can see. So bear with me if I manage to go off the screen, it's because I have no idea. But I have been with Disability Rights Wisconsin for 7 years. I am out of the Milwaukee office, as Bonnie stated, and I am primarily in the Kenosha and Racine counties, but I do have the southeast portion of the state, and I came to be a special ed advocate from struggling through special ed issues with my own son and learning what I needed to and fighting for him, and it's just shown me the need, and this is where my heart is. So I am here to offer what we are learning as we go through these times within special education.
So first of all, we thought, because I don't know if everyone knows what a protection and advocacy agency is. So Disability Rights Wisconsin is under that umbrella. Every state has a protection and advocacy agency, and it started in by passing the Developmental Disability Act of 1975. And I don't know if you know Geraldo Rivera. He was back in the early 70s. He did a piece, an investigation on New York's Willowbrook Institution, and there it was very visual of what was happening to our people with developmental disabilities. They were locked up in these institutions and treated very, very badly. We've seen pictures of them chained to walls where they, urinated and defecated on themselves. And it was just a real tragedy, and that actually spurred the Developmental Disability Act of 1975, which landed Disability Rights Wisconsin to be established in 1977. They first were called Wisconsin Coalition for Advocacy until they were renamed Disability Rights Wisconsin. And I think it happened around 2008, 2009, because I started with them in 2009. And, that they were Disability Rights Wisconsin by then. So what do? We are a free statewide resource that helps Wisconsin residents gain access to services and opportunities for advocacy and legal expertise. We operate on the following core values. Liberation, everybody should have, including people with disabilities, the freedom, they should be included. We should be helping them be independent to the maximum extent possible. you know, where they have dignity and accessibility, and their human rights are intact. So some of our programs are the Client Assistance Program called CAP. We have a program for disability benefits. We have a program on Medicare Part D helpline. So if you have any questions, we have a helpline to call about Medicare issues. We have the Family Care and Iris Ombudsman program. And then we have our Schools and Civil Rights program, the SSI Managed Care Advocacy, and most recently, no, this is second most recently, we have the Victim Advocacy Program, and then we have a protective payee program. So those are some of the programs, but Mary and I both mainly do schools, so special education, and victim rights. We did include a YouTube video. It's only a 2.5-minute clip, but unfortunately we're unable to show it because our sound isn't working. So I'm sure you can do it on your own time if you go to YouTube click on that link. And I just want to let you know that we have embedded many links in this presentation, and those are there for you to look at on your own time. So next, because this report that we're going to be talking about for the rest of the presentation, part of their data, a lot of their data comes from the Civil Rights Data Collection, or the CRDC. I wanted to take one slide to let you know what is a CRCD. So the CRCD has been collecting data since 1968 on key educational and civil rights issues. They were given the authority by the Department of Education Organization Act to collect this information. And they collect the information on basically discrimination laws, federal discrimination laws. One of them is Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibits discrimination based on race, color, and national origin. Title IX is the Education Amendments of 1972, which prohibits discrimination based on sex. And then finally, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability. So the data they collect is collected, so anyone getting federally funded from the federal government is required to follow these laws and required to hand over this data. So the CRCD collects data from nearly all public schools, pre-K through 12, in the 50 states, DC, and Puerto Rico. This also includes charter schools, alternative schools, juvenile justice facilities, and special education facilities, who are, again, recipients of federal funding. Over the years, they have concentrated on different issues, but mainly they collect data that measures factors that impact educational equity and opportunity for students. That includes access to courses, programs, resources, and school climate factors, such as student discipline, which we are really going to hone in on this presentation today. Their purpose is to monitor how schools are meeting their responsibilities to provide an equal education opportunity to students regardless of race, limited English proficiency, sex, or disability. And it is part of the OCR's overall strategy for administering and enforcing civil rights statutes that prohibit discrimination.
So with that, we will be referencing this report, Disabling Inequity, the Urgent Need for Race-Conscious Resource Remedies, by multiple people on this. You're oftentimes going to hear it as the Dan Lowson report. He was the main the main person that I think wrote the report, but they all had their hands in on it. So you're gonna oftentimes hear it as the Dan Lowson report or the Lowson report, but we just want you to know that there were other people that were involved in this. But from this, the Center for Civil Rights is housed out of the UCLA. And as part of an independent civil rights project, they use that data. And so from that data, that is then used by the Federal Department of Education. And this data specifically was focused on pre-pandemic data, which there's larger disparities and more issues now, but this is the data that we have. This is the report that we're using. So from that report, we took the DRW analysis of Wisconsin specific data, is what we're going to provide to you in a lot of these slides, and just talk about what those related efforts are that we have with the Department of Public Instruction and the federal efforts to address the inequities in education, and some of the recommendations that we might have in the other advocacy agencies. And then, you know, so part of and what we need to do moving forward, and we know that there may be a lot of questions, and we want to wait until we get to the end of this to make sure that we have enough time. So I think that what we discuss is that there's a questions panel that you can go ahead and put your questions in. It's not really a chat box, if I understood correctly, but if you know, you should be able to see that. I just don't know what I'm looking at here, because I'm showing the slides. So if you can hold off on the questions or post them, we will get to them at the end. So from the Civil Rights Project, this Disabling Inequity report, what the data tells us is broken up into 3 sections. And so the part 1 is the insufficient development of Section 504. And what that is, basically, there's a large group of students with disabilities that are in need of supports and services that districts should be identifying these students and supporting their needs. So their needs are essentially being ignored because of the fact that they may not need or qualify for specialized instruction. And so Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 also protects students that do not need specialized instruction from disability discrimination. So this requires that all public schools that get federal funds to identify students who don't need specially designed instruction, but they do have a disability that substantially limits one or more major life activities. So districts need to give these students a 504 only plan, which is a range of supports and services to ensure that they receive their FAPE, which is free and appropriate public education. This also will trigger the manifestation determination review protection for students if the school district is trying to expel the student. So part 2 of this project focuses on the special ed students, the disciplinary exclusions, law enforcement referrals, chronic absenteeism, which is a loss of instruction. And this is based on students with disabilities who are eligible for specialized instruction. So they have a special ed IEP. And as part of that, 14%, the data that this report showed is that 14% of all public school students in grades K through 12 have an IEP. Of that 14%, the 3 outcome areas were examined in discipline exclusion, law enforcement referrals, and chronic absenteeism, which showed that significant disparities were heightened for students with disabilities as well as for students of color. And they were heightened even further, but there was no breakdown for the non-white students receiving special education. So we need to look at that further. But essentially in the part 3 section, this is, you know, essentially what do we need to do? What are the state and federal efforts and policy recommendations? So we're going to go over all of those as well. And basically, you know, that effort is that we need additional funding. So this slide, we're going to talk about the data and the resources used in the Lowson's report. So what this shows is where the project took their data from. So I know that Jill talked about the Civil Rights Project and how it generates and produces their research on key civil rights and equal opportunity policies. that tend to get neglected or overlooked. And so they use that to define and highlight the racial injustice implications. And then that's used then for key policy choices for legislators, the media, general public, and to provide basically civil rights organizations the information, the data that they need to make change at the national, state, and local levels. So that's what the whole purpose of this data collection is about. And so the California Department of Education had worked closely with them when they released the data to help districts deal with their chronic absenteeism. And what they found is that Black students had the highest percentage of unexcused absences, and yet one of the lowest rates of excused absences, but also the highest rates of out-of-school suspensions. So, and this was only exceeded by foster youth. And so the other group with high averages of absences included students with disabilities. So we see that there's an issue with that. But that's where that California Department of Education chronic absenteeism data came from that pulled that information. And so then the Office of Special Education Programs, which is referred to as OSEP, they pulled out the data for each of the different categories. And so the OSEP is dedicated to improving results for infants, toddlers, children, and youth with disabilities, birth through age 21. So they provide leadership, financial support, and assist states and local school districts on what they need to improve upon. So they collect the data from the states and the students who receive early intervention, special education, or related services, and from those students that are under an IDEA special education program. And then they take those fast facts and summarize them to specific aspects of that data collection. That data presented includes collected through child count, educational environments and settings, discipline, and then other existing data collections. So that's just a brief overview of where all the data is coming from that's referenced in this report.
All right, so now we're going to move on to Wisconsin-specific data. And in this report, which I have a link to, I think in the second or third slide, it actually goes to the Civil Rights Office and or the center in California, and it goes right to their webpage, and you can find all this information. That report was, I don't know, like 200 and some odd pages, because it gave every state's percentages and numbers. So we're going to concentrate here in Wisconsin. So what they found for students receiving special education through an IEP, there's 14.1% of Wisconsin students have IEPs. So they rank 20th in the United States versus Section 504 only. Wisconsin is way down to the bottom, almost last at 1.1%. That students have 504 plans only. When we talk about this later too, that sometimes reporting the data is problematic, because some schools actually don't call 504 plans 504 plans. They call them accommodation plans, or they call them something else. And so maybe those plans are not being counted as 504 plans, but nevertheless, we are very low. Doing this work for many, many years, I have rarely gone to an initial IEP meeting where the student is found not eligible for special education, and the school does not say, oh, but let's see if your student qualifies for a Section 504 accommodations plan. It just stops at, okay, your student's not found eligible for special education. And then Wisconsin identifies Black students with the highest percentage found eligible for special education services than any other state at 22%. 1.2%. So yeah, Wisconsin needs some work to do. Okay, next slide. So why we can ask ourselves, why is there such low rates of 504 plans? Well, first, it's an unfunded federal mandate. So it's not an educational law, it's a discriminatory law. So the assumption is there shouldn't be any additional cost when providing all students access to an equitable education. There's also the assumption that schools should be providing or are able to provide accommodations to students who need them with current existing budgets. Because remember, to most, it's just giving students accommodations that they need to be in the general education setting. And the other thing is parents are not aware of Section 504 plans or know that their child may qualify if found ineligible for an IEP meeting. But here's the thing, what's Section 504? They still have to provide the student with a free, appropriate public education, which may include related services for a student to access a general education curriculum. Those related services are a cost to the district. I did include a link in here, and it gives the comparison of 504 versus IDEA. So an IEP versus Section 504 and the difference of the laws and what schools are required to do under each. So that would be nice if you guys took a look at that. I do have a tip in this situation. What I tell my parents is, and this is initial, your kids, you think your child needs special education, they're not on an IEP right now, but this is the start of, I think my kid needs special education or additional help. I'm going to request a special education evaluation from the school district. When you write that request, write it also for an evaluation for special ed and Section 504. This way the school knows, hey, if we get to the initial IEP meeting and the student is not found eligible for under IDEA or for an IEP, then the parent tends to also review and see if they qualify under a Section 504 plan. So that's the tip in that. So hopefully parents, if you're working with other parents.
So looking at a comparison of nationwide discipline disparities with Wisconsin, what this was, it's broken down. So this was calculated on days lost per 100 students, and that was to kind of make the sample size fair because some districts are much larger than others, and so we wanted to get as close of a comparison. So it's broken down by days lost per 100 students, and so nationwide, students with IEPs miss an average of 2 times as much school due to the suspensions than students without disabilities. In Wisconsin, students with IEPs miss 4 times as much school as those without disabilities. And so what we have for a comparison, students without disabilities nationwide lose 19 days to out-of-school suspension per 100 days, so 19 of every 100 days. Students with disabilities nationwide, this is, lose 41 days out of 100 students, okay? So a very significant difference. In Wisconsin, the students without disabilities lose 12 days to out of school out of 100 students in a year, and students with disabilities are losing 49 days out of 100 students. Significant difference in the data. And so Wisconsin has the 5th worst racial gap in student suspensions per this report, the data that has been collected. And so we're talking, the white students are 8 days missed out of 100 students. Native American are 31 days out of 100 students, and the Black students are 89 days out of 100 students are missed. So that's pretty significant disparity.
Can you imagine, missing 89 days from discipline? Just think if the student didn't attend, I think, how many days and they get a truancy? So,
Right.
schools can, find them truant for missing so little days, but yet they can suspend and expel. And these kids are losing lots and lots of days. And we're going to talk about those collateral consequences to that a little later.
Yeah, and these suspension days, the count, the data doesn't give us the intersection of race and disability. So it's broken up: students with disability, students without racial disparities, and white students. So there's not a combination. And then we have an EBD category, which is very intense for suspensions as well. So we're not meeting their social emotional needs within the school environment, is what that states. And these kids are missing school. That's the bottom line here. So that brings us into our Wisconsin specific data on the law enforcement referrals. And so we're going to talk about excessive rates, nationwide, of referral to law enforcement for student misconduct by students with disabilities. Nationwide, we're seeing this. Wisconsin alone, these are the top 3 districts that came out of that report. So Rhinelander has the most secondary students with IEPs referred to law enforcement at 19.4%. This is all data pulled from the Dan Lowson report. In Beloit, they have the highest rate of students with IEPs arrested at 10.66%. And then among the special education population arrested, 16.3% were Black students. Sun Prairie, extreme difference between Black and white students. 25.2% of Black students with IEPs referred to law enforcement, compared to only 5.8% of white students with IEPs. And so when we're talking about the consequences of missing school and being arrested, these students are then put on what you may or may not have heard, but likely have heard of, the school to prison pipeline. We have then higher rates of dropout and students not graduating, which leads to lower rates of post-high school employment, and higher rates of participating in criminal activities to earn money, especially facing barriers to employment due to those arrest records. We have students that are graduating from school, sometimes not even graduating from school, and they have arrest records because of disability-related needs being unmet within the educational environment. So these students tend to live in poverty and suffer poor health outcomes, and they increase the crime in the community. This is what happens when our students are referred to law enforcement for school-related issues and are not kept in school and being educated. And what we're seeing is our students are children who are learning. They're being arrested for minor behavioral issues. So they might get disorderly conduct tickets and charges for issues like cussing or being disrespectful to teachers or talking back. They're getting charges of battery or assault for fighting with another student, and maybe a teacher or another student was hit in the crossfire kind of situation. So all things that we've had all our lives growing up, we're seeing that these kids are now being arrested for and leaving school with criminal charges. We have little kids even mentioning, don't have to have one, don't have to make a threat. It could be a toy gun, but they're mentioning a weapon and they're being charged as a terrorist. So we're seeing that young children are being arrested. Children are then being handcuffed and fingerprinted, put in the back of police cars, taken to police departments, and this is causing trauma for these students. All the while, they're missing school because this is happening. They're then on court orders. They have to go back to court, miss school again. So it's lost instruction, lost instruction, lost instruction. That's what we're seeing for these students. And then what happens is some of the areas might do deferred prosecution type situations, and they have these requirements, these conditions that are held so high that it's almost guaranteed that they're going to break the terms of the conditions, and they're going to end up being incurring more infractions and charges from that information. So the other thing too that we want to mention here is that there's kind of a data reporting loophole, we feel, because this information, depending on how the data was requested, we know if some of my school districts, it's the school district will say, well, we didn't call the police, we didn't press those charges. And so what happens is the districts don't have to count that as a law enforcement referral because they've convinced their teachers, or they say, well, the teachers can do whatever they want. So the teachers then that are working with these children go and press charges. And so there's the law enforcement connection referral, the charges are happening at that point. So we don't know were all of those children and those referrals, did they make it into this data collection sample? That's kind of out there as, is the data kind of skewed here too? So it's not just what's happening and the effects of that discipline, but children are missing educational opportunities to learn how to do better in these situations. And that's the biggest issue.
I just want to mention too, I think the history of some of this. So back, I think in Clinton's administration in 1994, they passed the Guns Free School Safe Act, and which really spurred zero tolerance. But the zero tolerance in this act were for guns and guns only. Schools then took it beyond that, which we've had some cases of a student sharing an Advil with another student and under zero tolerance and getting disciplined from that. So our schools have added a whole bracket of things that fit under zero tolerance, meaning zero tolerance, no tolerance for this, and now you got to be punished in some way or disciplined. The other thing is, over the years, now I'm going to give my age away. I am 58, but when I went to school, there was no cops in the schools. Right. The principals dealt with this misbehavior. And so there's been a real paradigm shift of having police in our schools, and from not having police in our schools to really almost every district now has police officers either in their schools or close by, because they are doing the discipline for when I was a child, the principals would do. Which kind of leads us into the next situation, the next slide of seclusion and restraint.
Before we go there, Jill, I just want to point out too that the police in schools came about because of school shootings, and there's very little data to support that the police in schools are doing any good to stop or lessen or even keep fatalities or prevent. Yeah, they're not doing any good basically in the schools. So they're being utilized to manage our students with disabilities.
Yeah, well, and case in point, look at the last school shooting in New Mexico, right? So, now let's look at some Wisconsin-specific data for restraint and seclusion. So this is separate from the Lawson's report, but we believe when kids are secluded and restrained, it's not supposed to be considered discipline, but it really is, right? When you're removing a child from their classroom and placing them in a secluded room, they're not getting they're missing that education. So our Wisconsin's most recent data was taken from 2019 and 2020 school year. Luckily, though, our first Seclusion and Restraint Act was, I think, passed. I can't remember, 2011 maybe, but
I think it is 2011.
Right, but we now have an amendment to that, and so we made it actually better. So I included a comparison chart of Act 125, because that's our first one, and now Act 118. And so I will actually this will be a good time to just talk about some of those changes. So some of them include requiring parents to be provided with a copy of a written incident report, clarifying notice and reporting requirements apply to incidents involving law enforcement. So it used to be that parents had to request the seclusion and restraint report if seclusion and restraint was done on their child. What if parents didn't? We were coming across parents didn't even know that they could request that. So now it's required that the school district has to provide the parent this report within 3 business days. If law enforcement now is involved with a restraining incident, they have to be part of a debriefing about what could be done better, different, maybe examining what more into like what led up to the behavior, because I think as some of us know, parents can get these exclusion restraint reports with, this is what the child did, this is the consequence, but they're missing the whole triggering event from the beginning. So the antecedent, what happened? Where was the child? What classroom? What teacher? What, just when you're missing that information, you can't really put in a good behavioral intervention plan because you don't really know the antecedents. So it's a timing thing. You can't get in and provide them interventions if you don't know, right? So, and so they've made some really good changes here. So let's see here. I'm sorry, I'm reading from this. So they have to, upon the second time a child is restrained, the IEP team has to meet within 10 school days. That's another big one. But you can look at that comparison chart to see, and we've done a good job. And and we're going to talk about this later. We've been trying to get the federal government to pass like a seclusion restraint bill that would cover all the states, and they just have not yet been able to do that. So let's look at some of the numbers. So 81% of us, we always call it seclusion restraint, but the other reports go opposite. Restraint and seclusion incidents involve students with disabilities. That's a lot. 81%. That's just way too many. 2% of all students with disabilities were restrained, has suffered an experience of being restrained or secluded. And I say suffered because there is evidence that they are traumatized by these experiences. Some of the districts that stood out was Cedarburg, restrained 10% of its students with disabilities. Siren, which is more up north, secluded 11% of its students with disabilities. And so again, we have to be careful with any kind of large base data collection that requires fidelity across the board. So we were running into things that were either over-reported, not reported, or underreported simply because they didn't know the definition. Not all schools use the same definition of what seclusion is, what restraint is. So you are going to have, though, a little bit of skewed results when that happens. So what has with...
Did I go too fast?
I think maybe. Wait, can you go to the previous slide? Oh no, you're right. I'm wrong. Okay, so what has Wisconsin done to address discipline? Well, Wisconsin and other states have really been trying to address, and put in efforts to address this discipline disparities. So in 2009, DPI published this document called Alternatives to Expulsion. So that's the link there if you want to check that out on your own time. What it did is they highlighted like 5 or 6 school districts who were already using alternative approaches to expulsions. And it's all in that report. So in 2013, DPI created a discipline task force. And I was part of that task force. And what that task force did is they examined a preliminary analysis of Wisconsin discipline data. They looked at a literature review on effective strategies to reduce exclusionary student discipline. So what were all other states doing? And were there model states that were, reducing suspension and expulsions by using these strategies? Then we convened a task force to identify recommendations, strategies to reduce overall rates of disparities in exclusionary discipline, which, it's still a really broad and big issue. We still have, as you've seen with Lawson's report, I feel it's not getting better. In fact, it might even be getting worse. And so what came out of that task force was 8 recommendations that focused on policy reform, staff training and resources, and expanding data collection efforts, which we are now seeing being done. The other thing DPI has done is they had stakeholder input on racial equity in special education. That was done in 2018. Which they focus on getting criteria for identifying disproportionality in special education identification, placement, and discipline. And then most recently, there has been a Superintendent's Equity Council. Phyllis Greenberger, our co-worker, has been part of that. And it's just an ongoing council to address what can be done. So that isn't going away, I do not believe.
And so part of, I would say, Wisconsin efforts to address the discipline that I just want to add is that there has been some very recent talk of us looking further into data that compares apples to apples type discipline comparisons for students with disabilities and students without disabilities, as well as for students of color versus white students. And what are looking at all of them, what are the details of the incidents? Are similar punishments given for similar quote unquote crimes? Are fights being documented as fights across for all students, or are some students a fight being referred as a fight and then not up for expulsion or disciplinary action to the degree that an assault or another more serious type classification of it being. So looking at the details, are they being documented accurately? And then are the punishments, so to speak, the discipline for it, are they the same across from student to student to student? So, and then similar for those referrals to law enforcement. So we want to collect some of that data to see what we're looking at within each of the districts. So that brings us to the federal Department of Education efforts to address discipline. And so we had, schools are prohibited from discriminating against students based on race, color, national origin, sex, religion, or disability. So despite these laws, discrimination is rampant in the administration of school discipline. So that's what the data shows. And the data collected by the Department of Education clearly shows that that the Black students are suspended and expelled 3 times more often than white students, and students with disabilities are then twice as likely to be suspended or expelled as the students without disabilities. So we know this is happening. So in 2014, there was a Dear Colleague guidance that came out that provided guidance for districts that, what they had to follow. And part of that, and I think Jill wants to talk a little bit about this Milwaukee Public Schools OCR compliance review.
Yeah, so with that, you know, that the CRDC gathers data every year, every school year. So based on the data they collected from 2011, 2012, and then school year 2013-14, the numbers for Milwaukee Public Schools were just off the charts, and so that initiated an investigation on two legal issues, on whether MPS against Black students by disciplining them more frequently and more harshly than similarly situated white students, and whether MPS discipline policies had an unjust effect of discriminating against students on the basis of race. And they mention, even though their policy may not be intended, but it's happening. They're showing those effects, those negative effects on students of color. So their investigation concluded that MPS staff and their policies did discriminate against Black students by suspending them more than white students, gave Black students harsher consequences than white students, although their infractions were either identical or very similar, and that teachers were giving authority to subjectively discipline their students. And when that happens, you know, they could be, any teacher could say anything or discipline any other students, and you know, knowingly disciplining uh, Black students more than white students. So they had to follow a corrective action plan, and they did go into an agreement to, you know, um, revamp their policies and such.
So we know that in 2014, the Obama administration, Department of Education, issued guidance reminding schools that they must administer discipline policies in a non-discriminatory manner, and it provided resources to help schools ensure that they're providing equal opportunity for all students. And then in 2018, by the Trump administration and Betsy DeVos, they revoked that guidance. So then that brought us down to a request for comment on non-discriminatory administration of school discipline, July 23rd, from Biden's administration. And then that led to the most recent Dear Colleague letter on implementation of IDEA discipline provisions. And so that OSEP letter we've included a link to as well, so you can see the most recent Dear Colleague letter on that. And so from that, the restraint and seclusion that Jill was talking about, we have Bill 117, Proposed Keeping All Students Safe Act, that it took place, and that actually started, the first time it was introduced was back in 2009. And at that time, they were trying to regulate seclusion and restraint at the federal level. It passed the House in 2009, but it died in the committee in the Senate, and it has been, you know, reintroduced, and the movement hasn't stopped since then, but has not received a vote since 2009. So we know that in the state of Wisconsin, we have some really good protections that are not offered in other states for restraint and seclusion, and DRW works really hard for Wisconsin to do well with these legal regulations. So again, you can refer to Act 125 and then Act 118 and to see, you know, our restraint and seclusion laws. But so that's just where we're at on the federal level, and we've included the link to that bill so you can see where it's at. You can contact your legislators if you want to, you know, do something on that piece of it, but we've included all the links so that you have reference to it.
Mm-hmm. And I
Jill,
would
did
say,
you have anything to add?
Yeah, that I feel like if the federal bill is ever going to pass, they're going to be looking at states like Wisconsin on what they're doing, because I think we have come far from, you know, from all this and protecting our students with disabilities. I know we have about 8 minutes left, and so you're on, Mary, with the recommendations.
Yeah, so I'm going to kind of go more quickly through this. So currently at the state level for funding, We are currently at 30%. The governor has a budget proposal that looks to increase to 45% at the first biennial budget, and then 60% by 2024-25, and then up to 90% by the end of 2027. So the push for 90% comes from the fact that the state funds 90% for special education voucher students. And so we just don't feel public school students should be valued at less. So that's where our push for the 90% comes from. They're already paying that for the state voucher students. But you should know that while the governor has proposed this in his budget, he had a similar proposal last budget, but the majority in the legislature did not let it go through. And so on the federal level, we are currently sitting at 15%, and it has been sitting at around this 15% for decades. So when special education originally became federal law in 1975, the commitment was to fund special education to 40%. And so the push for the federal recommendation for funding is to continue pushing for that full 40% that was promised in 1975. And then where the state and federal level 504 plan funding, there just is not funding because they feel that accommodations don't incur costs. But as Jill mentioned earlier, there is cost that's incurred. And so currently they don't want to do it. They don't want to use their gen ed funding. We need funding that is going to provide districts for this 504 funding.
Mm-hmm.
So sorry if I'm going through too quickly.
Yeah, that's okay. We're kind of running out of time. So for staffing recommendations, you can look at these 4 recommendations and, well, I would say the first 3. And without that, the barriers to this, right, is funding and staff shortages right now. So how are we going to get smaller class sizes? That means you need more teachers, more classrooms to do that. You need more money to get the support staff. I started out as a school social worker for Green Bay, and when I realized then that I thought all schools had school social workers, but they don't. At that time, only the ones that did were urban area schools. So yes, we need more pupil services. And then increased collaboration for inclusion, including co-teaching. I know some of that goes on, that's happening now, but we need more good models of co-teaching. Now the last one, law enforcement staff do not belong in schools. I included a link, and I did test this link. It's not our typo, but I think police, it's supposed to be police, not policer. But it does work. I attended this presentation, and the reason why I put it in there is they do mention Madison, Wisconsin, proposing to not have school resource officers stationed in their school district. But that was the only one in the state of Wisconsin. So that is more to come on that. It's a big issue. We want to ensure all safety for all kids, but as you can see, the numbers show that our kids with disabilities are getting arrested. So here's some other ones. There's only 3 minutes, Mary. I just wanted to take some time for a few minutes anyway, for some questions. This is our last slide anyway. So yeah. Bonnie, do you have anything?
I have a couple of comments and then a question. The first one is there seems to be an effort to underreport disciplined students, those students who are of color and are in special education. I would guess from the information that you provided, you believe that that's definitely the case.
Yeah. Those percentage numbers, can definitely go up. I mean, look at about, someone who doesn't report a crime. There's reasons to that. So we know when we get these crime statistics that it's way higher than what they say. So yes, I agree. Mm-hmm.
There was another comment that said quite a few years ago, Wisconsin districts were told that they should not um, set up 504 plans, and there was a big to-do for people saying that not only is it necessary and the student's right, but that it's an obligation of the district to do so. That could have been really the beginning of the start of the reason why we don't see 504 plans as readily as we probably should. What are your suggestions as it relates to talking to IEP teams about including this as an option?
Well, like I said, that really starts with that evaluation, so parents really should be doing both in one. So asking for a special education evaluation and a Section 504 evaluation, because it's if the child doesn't qualify for special education or IEP, certainly the way the law is written, that the student would qualify for an accommodations plan or a Section 504 plan. And so just getting the word out, parent groups, Bonnie, you guys are the Parent Training Information Center, include this in your maybe include something on 504s for another presentation, or some of your publications that you give to parents. But certainly it is the law. Schools have to follow it because they get federally funded, and the word has to get out.
Sure. And we have a couple of webinars on Section 504. So parents, if you're on the call today, you
Good.
might want to take a look at those. And we also have some that are archived on our website for others. One other comment, because I know we're starting to run a bit late. This person said, I'm really glad that you talked about the statistics as it relates to police in schools, because as you can see by the information that you provided and other information, students who are part of having IEPs, and also students of color, are those that are really disciplined more as it relates to like an SRO in the schools. So basically, I think this is a comment, and do you want to comment on that, either one of you?
Mary, you got a comment?
I don't. I am lost in the screen over here, so I'm sorry I didn't hear it all. I can't get my screen back
the
up.
numbers, the data, really, there's truth in that data. And so we just got to keep pushing for more data, extrapolating that data by different groups and protected groups, and really be on the state and follow through what's going on with bills. You got advocacy, you got to advocate with the legislature, your local representative. So, I mean, there's many steps that you can do, but yes, the numbers do not lie.
Okay, I just have two comments. Mary, we can see you, but you might not be able to see your stuff, but we can see you. And then the next comment that just came in was that the police-free school presentation link is not working for them. So like, if you might want to take a look at it and maybe mail the new link to me, I can pass it out to people who need it if it's not working for others as well. But that was the comment that we just had. And because we're running late, unfortunately, I'm going to have to ask both Mary and Jill if you have any closing comments that you would like to make at this time, because we will need to end.
I'll send you that PowerPoint PDF, and you can get it out to the folks. Okay, Bonnie?
That'll be
Thank
great.
you for
Thank you.
Thank you for
I just tried
attending.
the link myself, and it's not working. You're correct. Whoever sent in the question, they're correct. It's not working. So we'll have to update the link before we send it, maybe. My own final thought or takeaway is really that we need to stop criminalizing our students. We need to provide them the supports and services. We need to keep them in schools and being educated. And it's going to take all of us to get this done. So that's what I would like for the takeaway to be.
I agree.
Okay. Well, thank you both so very much for a really informative webinar today. I think the information that you provided will go a long way for both parents and professionals to be able to utilize in their justifications as they move forward. So we greatly appreciate the time that you took to help us out in this respect. If there are people that are on the call and are interested in receiving the free schools presentation link, release free schools presentation link, please send me an email and I will send it out to you after Jill and Mary send it to me. So you'll have the PowerPoint for that going forward. Again, this will conclude our webinar for today. We'd like to thank all of you for joining us. Please be reminded that Wisconsin Facets has over 100 scheduled trainings and webinars for 2022 and 2023. So please check out our website calendar and register for any of the upcoming trainings that may be of interest to you. Also, please watch for the short evaluation that will be coming your way after today's live presentation. Again, Mary, Jill, thank you so very much for your presentation today, and thank you all for joining us. Bye-bye, everybody.
You're very welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.